Hello and welcome to the CEO interview series where I am interviewing Dan French, the founder and CEO at Consider, on a number of areas concerning shared services organisations, specifically around control and compliance, risk, KPIs and key exception indicators and exception analytics. So today we're focusing in our third chapter on KPIs and key exception indicators. So hello, Dan.
Hi, Susie.
Let's kick off with, this is going to be a theme that resonates with a lot of shared services professionals who are putting a lot of focus on specifically KPIs right now. So let's kick off with just defining the difference, if you will, between a KPI and a KEI.
Okay, this is a subject close to my heart, and it's related to human behaviour and law of unanticipated consequences and those things we've discussed before. But KPIs, so key performance indicators, are really important ways of measuring outcomes in a business. So not debating that, we all use them. I think the big worry with KPIs, and anybody who's managed an organisation knows this is true, is whatever KPI you put in place, the organisation will drive to meet it, but there are usually unanticipated consequences, and sometimes you find the KPI you've set actually isn't quite the KPI perhaps you thought it was, and sometimes it has a detrimental impact on something else which is important. So I'll give you a very classic example. Well, it's rather extreme actually, but an organisation we're dealing with who had a very good cash collections measure. So their days sales outstanding at first look at a particular area for receivables looked very, very good. But the finance executives were a little bit concerned. It didn't quite seem to work that way when they looked at cash. And the situation was that the accounts receivable folks in this organization had a very clear cash collection DSO metric they had to meet. So with their largest customers, they were sending invoices to the customer. In fact, they were sending invoices to the customer and then talking to the payables people in the customer and say, right, is all this correct? Are you ready to pay it? And the point at which the customer says, yes, that's going to go into the next payment run, the receivables people say, right, well, ignore that document. We're going to send you the proper invoice now and pay that. And what became clear was they were sending out pro forma invoices to clarify, to get to the point where the customer was happy to pay, and the DSO measure only kicked off from the point at which the official invoice was generated. So by the time the official invoice was generated, they were getting paid within less than 2 weeks, typically. So they had an amazing cash collections measure. But it was completely nonsense because the cycle time from when the goods had been delivered and when the invoice really went out was much longer. But they were so focused on meeting their target that that's what they were doing. Mm-hmm. And there's so many examples of this. It's, I think everybody has seen those in every area of business. So my point about KPIs is they're good, but you've got to also work out what can go wrong. What can go wrong is what we regard as key exception indicators, because the balance of the two gives you a healthy business.
So in that case then, Dan, looking at the receivables treatment of how they were managing the cash collection process, if a KEI had been in place, how would that have helped avoid this situation?
Well, what we did there was to look at the lead. So the KPI they decided was DSO, but we also looked, and DSO is typically from invoice to cash collection. We decided also to look at, because although an extreme version is not an uncommon situation, we decided to look at cycle times from delivery of goods or from order, depending on the type of business, but in this case, delivery of goods to payment or delivery goods to invoice even. And if delivery goods to invoice is more than, let's say, 5 days, it depends on the business, then there's something funny going on. And in this case, delivery goods to invoice was, in some cases, was taking up to 4 weeks, which is completely inappropriate. But in general, what I found is, and just taking this DSO example, we know days sales outstanding is a healthy measure. We know it's an aggregate measure of performance. So if our DSO is 39 or 40 or 41 days, that's fine. That's the average number of days from invoice to payment. But the problem with it is we only know there's an issue when that goes to 42, or goes into the red, if you like. And then there's a manic set of activities to try and work out what happened, what's causing the issue, and try and fix it and go back. What it doesn't really give you is any early warning that things might be going wrong, or indeed whether 39 or 40 is a good number for you or whether you could do better. And what we found is by looking at the flip side, what are the things that can go wrong that might mean you don't meet your DSO targets, then you start to see some other things that might impact it. So things that impact payments or receivables, let's say, is are you credit checking? Are you managing the credit of your customers? Are you managing payment terms so you know that the customer's likely to pay in a reasonable time frame? Are you managing delivery quantity and quality so you know they've got no excuse not to pay? And are you managing the process from delivery to invoice, which we just talked about? If you look at these things, these are the exception indicators that can impact your DSO. They could mean, if you see issues in these will give you an early warning to your DSOs going off the charts later. Mm-hmm. So it's just a way of giving a balanced view of performance to avoid you getting unpleasantness later on.
Okay. So I suppose another way of looking at it or referring to it could be looking at it as a leading KPI or a laggard KPI. I think that's
absolutely, that's right on the money. So for those of you who've kind of looked into balanced scorecard thinking, the Kaplan and Norton stuff, that was all about leading indicators and lagging indicators. And KPIs are classic lagging indicators. They're measuring the result and outcome of an activity, and it's important. But the critical thing that organizations have really not implemented in that thinking is the leading indicators. And KEIs, exception indicators, are leading indicators of success. Mm-hmm. KPIs are lagging indicators. And as balanced scorecard thinking exposes, is if you've got both well managed, mm-hmm. you're in good shape. If you've only got one of them managed, you're probably not in such good shape.
Okay, so some more questions around the KPIs and KEIs then. How well do you feel that if we look at the shared services market, how well do you feel that the shared services market has grasped the KEI approach and applied it to their own business processes?
Well, I think shared services in general is maturing, certainly well into adolescence now, I'd say. And I think KPIs have really been the issue du jour, certainly in the past year or two. That's been a big focus. So yes, you've got to have the KPIs in. I think now organizations are waking up to the fact that you can have a great set of KPIs, but your customers aren't happy and something's not, your business performance isn't right. So what's going on? And I think organizations are waking up to the fact that either we have to have lots more KPIs or else there's something else missing. I think people are waking up to the idea that leading indicators might be the answer, or certainly a balance of leading and lagging indicators. So I think it's early days, but we've certainly had some very interesting successes with organizations starting to apply this, where they're starting to realize that some of their KPIs, whilst they look good, are hiding a lot of unpleasantness under the covers. I mean, I'll give you an example. A classic KPI we've talked about before is, companies trying to maximize the spend under PO. It's a good KPI to make sure that you've got well-controlled expenditure. And that's great, and that KPI can look great. But what that can also lead to is applying POs for things that the organization is not well structured to do. And we see situations where a KEI might be multi-touch purchase orders, by which I mean a purchase order gets created kind of as a pro forma, and staff come back to update the PO through the process. Now, that is a time-consuming, expensive, and error-prone activity, but often it happens because the way the process really works is for certain types of purchases, it's just complicated for them to get the information. So, one organization in wholesale distribution, we saw 11% of their purchase orders were getting multiple touches, which were completely unnecessary, which means a waste of effort, lots of scope for error and waste again. And of course, 11% might not be a massive percentage in terms of amount of these POs get touched multiple times. But again, you've got to think about the asymmetric level of effort required after the fact. When the more you touch any document, whether electronic or physical, the more scope for error, more scope for, or the more need for fixing things after the event. And that costs time and money.
So also what we're finding is that shared services organisations on the whole will have their kind of very clear KPI set, or indeed KEI, though they might be referring to it as a KPI. And often that's driving a lot of behaviour and a lot of the focus in the shared services organisation. What I sense, though, is that sometimes these KPIs were set 9, 10, 11 months ago, and it's driving a particular behaviour which is actually not the required behaviour for the business in the moment. So how often should these KPIs or KEIs be changed and updated?
That's an interesting point. Again, you're touching the issue of human behavior. I mean, my observation is any measure you put in place, which you monitor, what is it, what you don't measure, you can't manage, then the organization will tend towards achieving it, so it'll improve. But that's okay, provided it really is the measure you care about. Now, the problem is in any organization, the micro level KPI for a particular department or a particular sub-process always has an interesting relationship with other elements of the process. And if you over-optimize one piece, something else fails. So I think it's very, very important to, well, certainly to review KPIs and KEIs, the leading indicators, on a regular basis, certainly on an annual basis, to make sure that you are getting the effects you want and you're getting the behavior you want. Because ultimately this is what it's about, it is driving the behavior you want. And I think too many KPIs, because they're focused on outcomes, they ignore the behavior that's required to get to the outcome, and so sometimes you get the wrong sort of behavior happening even though the outcome seems right. So I definitely think annual review of those don't necessarily have to be changed, but you need to work out, are we getting the behavior we want, not just are we getting the results we want.
In your opinion, Dan, what is the optimum amount of KPIs, say, in accounts payable that should be captured? And also, how does a KPI in AP differ from just a standard metric in AP? And do you think people know the difference between the two?
Well, I'm wary of spending too much time on the label, but if you have a performance measure of outcome in accounts payable, which be the number of invoices per FTE, a whole bunch of others, spend on the PO, then for each lagging indicator, you want to make sure you've got at least one leading indicator. Typically, it's two, actually. For each lagging indicator, you've probably got two leading indicators because that kind of gives you a good kind of pinch point. So I would say, so if you've got accounts payable function, you don't want to have too many KPIs. So let's say they've got 3 or 4 KPIs. For each one of those, you might have 1 or 2 leading indicators.
So let's just zoom in on one lagging indicator. And I know that you touched on a bit of an example with the DSO one earlier, but if we just zoom in on productivity per FTE, you would classify that as a lagging indicator, would you?
Yes, I think that's a lagging indicator because you only know the productivity per FTE after they've done it.
Okay, and so if you can give us a couple of examples of what a leading indicator for that lagging indicator would actually be.
Okay, so productivity per FTE, things that can go wrong with invoices through FTE. For example, duplicate invoices improves your productivity. Your productivity goes up if you get duplicate invoices, which means that you tend not to focus on duplicate invoices because your productivity goes up. You've got more invoices for the people, but actually they're not always the right invoices. So a good example there would be, are we getting any duplicates?
And productivity would go up if, for example, invoices came in with a purchase order quoted on them.
Yeah, I mean, it depends, of course, assuming it's right. So a lead exception indicator may be kind of invoices coming in without PO information is a good exception indicator. I think the other piece is in invoice per FTE productivity. Another thing that can go wrong is to do that, you're trying to maximize the touchless nature of invoices. So another thing that can go wrong is overpayments. To maximize the throughput of invoices, we see organizations tuning their payment tolerances, let's say, to deal with currency exchange rates and all the rest of it. And we've seen organizations that have very good productivity per FTE, but have a rather high amount of overpayments for invoices that are being invoiced for more than they've received. Now, sometimes it comes down to perhaps aggressive currency exchange positions taken by the vendor, but it's usually because these tolerances have been set too loose to allow the easy flow of payments. So up to 5%, some people argue 5% is quite a reasonable tolerance. If I get an invoice for 5% more than I should, then that's not worth worrying about. Well, 5%, when you add up those 5%, that's quite a lot of money.
Dan French, thank you very much indeed. Please join us for the next chapter, Chapter 4, where I'll be talking to Dan about exception analytics.